Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Challah. We're up to Perek Gimel Mishnah Hey. Today's Mishnah should be Leil Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev Neriyahu ben Burcha Yisraelov Menuchatam Began Eden Amen. The Torah in Sefer Bamidbar, chapter 15, pasuk 21, uses the term Arisotechem, your doughs, to describe the dough from which Challah must be taken. The Gemara in Masechet Menachot, page 67a, teaches us that this term Arisotechem excludes dough that belongs to a non-Jew. The Mishnah now is going to discuss a number of cases relating to this halakha. Oved kochavim shenatan liYisrael la'asot lo isa. If a non-Jew gave flour to a Jew to make dough for the non-Jew, pitura min ha'challah, the dough is exempt from the challah obligation because it belongs to the non-Jew. Netanah lo matana. If the non-Jew gave this dough as a gift to the Jew who was preparing the dough, so the law depends on the following. Ad shelo gilgel. If the non-Jew gave the dough to the Jew before the Jew completed kneading the dough, hayav, the Jew is obligated to separate challah when he completes kneading the dough, because the dough is owned by a Jew and the challah obligation takes effect. Umeshe gilgel. However, if the non-Jew gave the dough to a Jew after he completed kneading the dough, patur, then he is exempt from challah because it still belonged to the non-Jew at the time the challah obligation took effect. Now, only a dough containing at least 5 riva'im of flour is subject to the challah obligation, like we learned in chapter 2, Mishnah 6. So the Mishnah now discusses a case in which a dough is owned partly by a Jew and partly by a non-Jew. If a Jew makes a dough together with a non-Jew, meaning each one owns part of the dough, the halakha is that if the portion owned by a Jew does not contain the minimum amount subject to the challah obligation, 5 riva'im of flour, pitua min ha'challah, the dough is exempt from the challah obligation. Although the entire dough contains 5 riva'im of flour, the portion of the dough that is owned by the non-Jew is not counted towards the minimum measure subject to challah, since the portion owned by the Jew by itself does not contain the minimum measure for the challah obligation. It is not subject to the challah obligation. And the Mishnah is implying, the Mishnah implies that if the Jew owns 5 riva'im of the flour, the dough is subject to the challah obligation, because the fact that a non-Jew owns part of the dough is not a reason to exempt the Jew's portion on its own. And that's where the implication is, if the Jew would own 5 riva'im of flour, the dough would be subject to the challah obligation. That is not Rabotai of Mishnah Hey. Mishnah now continues discussing a case in which the non-Jewish owner of a dough converted to Judaism. We're continuing on this path of a dough owned by a non-Jew. Ger shenit gayer, if someone converted to Judaism, vayta lo isa, and he owned the dough, the halakha is as follows. Na'aset ad shelo nitgayer patur. If it was completed, meaning wheat dough that was completely kneaded, or barley dough that was packed together, if that was done before he converted patur, he is exempt from separating challah from it because it belonged to a non-Jew when the challah obligation took effect. However, if the dough was completed after he converted, he is obligated to separate challah from it because he was a Jew when the challah obligation took effect. Dim safek, if it is uncertain whether the dough was made before he converted or afterwards, chayav, he is obligated to separate challah from it, because since there is a doubt whether the dough is subject to the challah obligation, we must deal with it strictly and separate challah. The challah that is separated is called safek challah, doubtful challah. Since the dough may have been owned by a Jew when the challah obligation took effect, the portion separated as challah may be actual challah that may not be eaten by non-kohanim. But on the other hand, since it may have been owned by a non-Jew at the time, it may not be challah. Therefore, based on the principle of hamutzi mechavero alav haraya, the burden of proof is on the one seeking to take from his fellow. The Kohen has no legal claim to the challah since he cannot prove that he has a right to it. But nevertheless, since only a Kohen can eat it, the owner has no choice other than to give it to a Kohen to eat. But the owner may charge the Kohen money for it. The Mishnah continues, Ve'en chayivin alei chomesh. However, if non-Kohanim unlawfully ate this challah that was separated only out of a doubt, they are not obligated to pay an added fifth on account of eating it, because normally a non-Kohen who mistakenly eats challah must replace it with produce of the same value as an atonement, and he also must pay the Kohen an added penalty, which amounts to a fifth of the total amount that he's paying. This is spoken about in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 22, pasuk 14. And in a case of a doubt, however, the Mishnah is telling us that the non-Kohen is not obligated to separate the added fifth. And the Mefarshim explain, in order for the Kohen to have a legal claim to the fifth paid as a penalty, he would have to prove that a non-Kohen definitely ate challah. But here, however, he's not able to do so because no one knows whether the dough from which the challah was separated was actually subject to the challah or not. So the non-Kohen, therefore, is not obligated to pay the fifth. Now, the Mefarshim explain, in fact, the same logic tells us that the non-Kohen is also not obligated to repay the principal, because as to how he gains atonement for having eaten doubtful challah, it would be sufficient to simply take produce that has the value of the doubtful challah that was eaten and designate it as challah. After designating it, he doesn't have to give it to the Kohen for free, because like we explained, the Kohen cannot prove that the non-Kohen actually ate challah. Now, the fifth doesn't have to be designated, even though you don't have to give, you don't have to designate it either, because the atonement is not dependent on the fifth. Therefore, the fifth doesn't have to be paid in cases of a doubt, like our case, where it's possible that the non-Kohen did not commit any sin at all. The Mishnah now quotes Rabbi Akiva, who disagrees with the Tanakama regarding the stage upon which the halacha is dependent. Rabbi Akiva says, Hakol olech achar kirima batanur. It is entirely dependent on the time of the formation of a crust in the oven, meaning whether the convert is obligated to separate challah from his dough does not depend on whether he was a Jew at the time of the kneading of the dough. Rather, it depends on when the dough formed the crust in the oven. And the Mefarshim explain, according to Rabbi Akiva, the dough becomes subject to challah when a crust is formed on the bread, not when the dough is completed. In fact, the same applies to the other cases that we discussed in this chapter until this point. Rabbi Akiva holds that all the laws taught will depend on whether the dough develops a crust rather than on when the dough is completely kneaded. But the Rav does tell us, Ven halacha ki Rabbi Akiva, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Akiva. That is on Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen v'amen.